My best friend since childhood chased Asher for 5 years but didn't succeed. Then she turned around and cheated on me with my boyfriend, which was a huge betrayal. I never thought that the plot of being betrayed by both my best friend and my boyfriend would happen to me. So when I witnessed it with my own eyes, I was completely stunned. Celeste cried and explained to me, saying that they had drunk too much, begging me to forgive them and asking me not to tell Asher. Her almond-shaped eyes were swollen from crying. Since childhood, what I liked most about Celeste was her eyes. They were round and always seemed to be full of affectionate glances. When she looked at you timidly, it could make you feel a tingling sensation in your heart. But now, when I looked at them again, I just felt cold, bitterly cold. After more than 20 years of friendship, how could she bear to hurt me like this? I sat numbly on the sofa in the living room. The reason I didn't leave was that Damon said he wanted to talk to me. Although I didn't think there was anything left to talk about between me and them. One breakup, one severing of friendship, clean and straightforward. It was painful to cut ties, but it was better than keeping them and continuing to disgust myself. More than 10 minutes had passed before the two of them came out of the bedroom, fully dressed. Let's break up. I clenched my fists and tried hard to make my voice sound calm. Hearing me say the word break up, Damon frowned and looked gloomy. Let's talk about this later. Calm down first. I sneered. Calm down? How much calmer do I need to be? It's already calm enough that I didn't stab you on the spot, okay? Damon couldn't find anything to say. His already dejected face became even uglier. He lowered his head, took out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, opened it, took out one and put it in his mouth, then thought about it and stuffed it back. Because I would cough when I smelled cigarette smoke, he never smoked in front of me. If it weren't for being caught cheating, Damon could be considered a boyfriend who was extremely satisfactory in all aspects. He had regular features, a decent job, was gentle and polite to others, and was extremely considerate to me. Even my parents thought he was the right person for me to spend my life with. And at this moment, my former sweetheart was sitting on the stool opposite me with his hands down, as if repenting. A few minutes later, he raised his eyes to look at me, with a touch of red at the corners of his eyes. I don't agree to break up, his voice trembled with restraint. But how could he think that I was discussing it with him? I didn't respond, just stared at him fixedly. After being in love for many years, he naturally knew what my silence meant. Damon reached out to try to pull me, but I dodged by turning sideways. Those eyes that always looked bright when looking at me were covered with a layer of mist after seeing my move. He lowered his posture and begged me, "Forgive me this time, Ruby. I was just confused for a moment. I definitely won't do it again in the future. Could you give me one more chance?" Celeste, who was sitting aside, visibly became ugly on her affected little face after hearing his words. Secretly observing the behavior and expressions of the two of them, I somehow felt a morbid sense of pleasure rising within me. I even started to consider whether to pretend to agree to Damon's plea for peace and then irritate Celeste. But as soon as this thought emerged, I immediately rejected it. Forget it. Just thinking about it made me feel sick. I admit that I'm so angry that I'm going crazy and want to do something to take revenge. Fortunately, I haven't lost my sanity yet. Before, when I saw social news about the original spouse beating up the mistress, I had discussed with Celeste whether such behavior was advisable or not. At that time, she pouted slightly and said coquettishly, "If Asher were with someone else, I would definitely go and tear that girl apart. Ruby, you'll help me, right?" She said this with complete confidence, even though she had never been Asher's girlfriend. I had also imagined that if Damon cheated one day, according to my personality, I probably wouldn't make things difficult for or resent the third party. After all, flies don't land on seamless eggs. But that third party, it just couldn't be Celeste, it just couldn't be her. Damon, now you know, it's you too, disgust me. After I said this, the color drained from Damon's face, and I walked out of the rental house without looking back. I will never set foot in this place again in my life. On the way to the subway station, which took more than 10 minutes, I received countless sideways glances. It must be because I was crying like an idiot. Actually, compared to Damon's cheating, what made me even more sad was Celeste's betrayal. From kindergarten to university, and then staying together in this strange city that wasn't our hometown, I thought that even when our hair turned gray, we would still hold hands and watch the flowers bloom and the sunset together. However, the lifetime I had imagined came to an abrupt end like this. Back at the house that Celeste and I rented together, I hid in my room, covered my head with the quilt, and cried bitterly. It wasn't until I heard a knock on the door outside that I got out of the quilt, blew my nose messily, and ran to open the door. Outside the door was Asher. He handed me a bottle of ice-cold mineral water, his eyes deep and dark. Put it on your eyes. They're all swollen from crying. I didn't stand on ceremony with him and reached out to take it and pressed it against my forehead. I had been crying for so long that my head hurt. It felt much better when it was cooled by the cold mineral water bottle. Why are you here? I asked him. Celeste called me and said you had a quarrel with her. Asher's voice was a bit low and it sounded especially nice when he spoke slowly. I had a quarrel with her? That was putting it too lightly. Severing friendship and having a quarrel were not on the same level. Rolling the round mineral water bottle onto my eyelids, I continued to ask in a hoarse voice, did she say why I had a quarrel with her? She said she sprained her ankle and Damon helped her, and then you misunderstood. Because my eyes were closed, I couldn't see his expression. I only heard him sigh and murmur after that, is it really that much of a liking? It wasn't necessarily that much of a liking. It just felt like my heart was being pinched and aching again and again. I didn't know if it was for my lost love or friendship. Probably both. Was Celeste afraid that I would tell Asher and played a preemptive move? Actually, it wasn't necessary. I didn't plan to let her have an easy time, but stabbing someone in the back like this was too childish. And even if I told him, Asher might not believe it. Perhaps the water mist attached to the bottle had condensed into beads and slid down onto my cheeks, but clearly the water was cold. Why were the beads that slid down warm? Asher didn't say anything else either and just quietly accompanied me. A few minutes later, he asked, "Are you hungry?" I let out a sob and nodded while sobbing. "Let's go. I'll take you to dinner." We went to a popular hot pot restaurant and ordered the spiciest hot pot base. Before I finished the meal, I was already sweating profusely. Now, besides my eyes, my mouth was also swollen. Asher held out a few tissues and handed them to me. His fingers holding the tissues were long and fair, his nails were cut short, clean, and a healthy light pink, with small, round half-moon marks at the tips. I stared at his hands for a long time and blurted out, "Asher, let's be together." Asher's hand that was raised in the air trembled. He slightly lowered his eyes, and his long eyelashes blocked the light in his eyes. "The reason," he said slowly, his voice colder than I had ever heard before. "Ruby, tell me the reason." Could I say that I wanted to use him to take revenge on Celeste? I admit that what I did, to put it seriously, was a sign of a distorted personality. But I really couldn't help it. I was crazy to do something to make Celeste uncomfortable and achieve some kind of psychological balance. And Asher was undoubtedly the sharpest sword that could stab her. Celeste had a soft personality and was cute. Before junior high school, she was often bullied by little boys. Every time someone bullied her, she would come crying to me. Then I would rush over to fight with the other person like a reckless fool. If I couldn't win by fighting, I would bite with my teeth or throw stones. I had a front tooth that was knocked out when it was a bit loose during the tooth-changing period because I bit someone too hard. At that time, my mouth was full of blood, and all the kids watching were scared to tears. There was also a scar the size of a little finger on my head, which was left from fighting for her. That spot has been bald until now. So even though I didn't like long hair, I never thought about cutting it short. Before today, if Celeste was in danger, I, Ruby, would definitely risk my life to protect her. But how could she betray me? I put down my chopsticks, covered my eyes with both hands, and tried my best to suppress the tears welling up in my eyes. I cursed myself in my heart over and over again. Ruby, you're so useless, so useless. When we came out of the hot pot restaurant, it was completely dark outside. There were a few scattered stars hanging on the black curtain of the sky. How long had it been since I last looked at the stars properly? The last time seemed to be 5 years ago when Celeste and I ran to the open balcony to watch the meteor shower. In the middle of the winter night, we wrapped ourselves in the same quilt and shivered with cold. In the end, we didn't see the meteor shower but caught a cold together. Thank you for tonight. I'll split the meal cost with you later, I looked up at him and said in a muffled voice. I had been crying for too long and my nose was blocked. Although we had known each other for several years, Asher and I weren't very familiar. Every time we met before, Celeste was always by his side and Damon was with me. Going out to eat alone, this was the first time. Asher gave me a casual glance and still spoke calmly, no need. You can treat me back another day. I nodded in agreement and said goodbye to him. Wandering on the busy street with people and cars coming and going, I actually didn't know where to go. I didn't want to go back to the rental house. I was afraid that if I met Celeste, I wouldn't be able to resist slapping her, and I was also afraid that if I didn't meet her, I would start thinking wildly, wondering if she was doing something immoral with Damon again. My mind was in a mess. When I wanted to calm down and sort out my thoughts, it went blank again. As I was walking, suddenly someone grabbed the hood of my hoodie from behind and pulled it back hard. My body bumped into a solid wall of flesh. Ruby, are you fucking tired of living? Asher's voice rose, and his chest trembled. The body pressed against my back was very tense, as if he had been extremely frightened. This was the first time I heard him swear. He had always been cool and reserved. Shouted at by him, I just noticed that I had almost run a red light just now. I took a step to the side to distance myself from him. I looked up at him and gave an awkward smile. I was distracted just now. Thank you. Asher didn't say anything. He just pressed his lips tightly together and looked at me with sharp eyes. It seemed that he was really angry. I shrank back, feeling that he was being a bit unreasonable. After a long while, he let out an almost imperceptible sigh and then said slowly, "Let's go. I'll take you home." His voice had returned to its usual coldness. I opened my mouth but finally couldn't bring myself to say that I didn't want to go back. When we got downstairs in the community, Damon was leaning against the street lamp at our door, smoking. There were cigarette butts scattered all around on the ground. Seeing me come back, he quickly put out the cigarette and came up to me. Perhaps because he had smoked too much, his voice was as hoarse as if stones were scratching sandpaper. Where have you been? I've been waiting for you for a long time. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me a certain distance away from Asher, his eyes fixed on my still swollen lips. His light brown pupils shrank slightly, and he said in a flustered tone, you can't take revenge on us like this. Look, he knew me so well. He even understood my little dark thoughts clearly. I curled my lips and smiled with contempt. Damon, how dare you? After saying that, I twisted my arm, trying to break free from his grip. After struggling for a long time, I finally had to admit that the difference in strength was too great and I couldn't break free at all. I glared at him, gritted my teeth, and said, "Don't touch me. You're dirty." Damon's tall figure swayed a little, but he still held on to me tightly. His eyes were wide open, and his eye sockets were flushed red. His thin lips were tightly pressed together into a line, and he was just stubbornly refusing to let go. After a few minutes of stalemate, a very good-looking hand appeared on Damon's wrist. Damon had a healthy wheatish complexion, which made that hand look even fairer. Asher frowned and his voice was still cold and indifferent without much intonation. Let go. His red lips opened and closed, still a bit swollen. In the eyes of those who didn't know the situation, it really seemed a bit charming. Damon let go of me and cursed, "Fuck." Then, gritting his teeth, he rushed towards Asher like a madman and the two of them immediately started fighting. I originally wanted to stop them, but seeing that Asher had the upper hand, I took a few steps back and stood aside with my arms folded, watching the excitement calmly. A few minutes later, Celeste rushed out from somewhere, threw herself forward and pulled them apart. She opened her arms and stood in front of Damon. Her small face, which was about the size of a palm, was covered with tear stains. Celeste's sobs were mixed with obvious panic. Nothing really happened between Damon and me. Asher, don't believe what Ruby said. It seemed that she thought I had told Asher about her dirty deeds with Damon, which led to their fight. After more than 20 years of friendship, she betrayed me first, and now she was trying to shift the blame onto me. Asher looked up and glanced at me, then wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with his thumb. The bright red blood left a long, thin mark at the corner of his mouth. Compared to his usual coldness, he looked much more vivid now, with a somewhat evil and charming look, which really surprised me. Ruby didn't say anything. Whether you two had something or not has nothing to do with me. When he spoke, his eyes were looking at me, the street lamp reflected a faint light in his eyes, floating and sinking, like broken stars. I hid the surprise in my eyes, skipped over Asher, and fixedly stared at Celeste, who was as pale as a ghost not far away, and said sarcastically, "What, are you scared now? Why didn't you think there would be today when you were fooling around with Damon in bed? I wouldn't stab someone in the back. I usually dealt with things face to face, so that it wouldn't seem like I was slandering her. I wouldn't stab someone in the back. I usually dealt with things face to face, so that it wouldn't seem like I was slandering her." Her tone was full of grievance and astonishment. She was really good at pretending. I didn't bother talking nonsense with her either. I directly took out my phone and shook it. "Do you want me to play the recording?" She stared at the phone in my hand with red eyes but didn't dare to say anything in the end. Half an hour later, I accompanied Asher to the community hospital. It wasn't because of the fight but because he was allergic to the spicy food he ate. I sat on his right side, watching the transparent liquid drip slowly from the tube and then flow into his body through the thin needle inserted into the back of his hand. I had mixed feelings. I hadn't realized before that Asher was such a chivalrous person. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you couldn't eat too spicy food." Asher leaned back in the chair, his head tilted slightly backward, with a hint of hidden loneliness in his expression. "Didn't you investigate me?" "In sophomore year." I awkwardly scratched the ground with my toes and didn't respond. Asher was the elected campus heartthrob at University back then, and he had many admirers. A person like him, who was on a pedestal, wouldn't have had any interaction with an unknown nobody like me, but Celeste had a crush on him. She was shy, so she begged me to help her gather information. In the end, there were rumors that I was chasing Asher. Even Asher's roommate, who provided me with information, was urging me to confess my feelings. Reluctantly, I told his roommate the truth. Asher closed his eyes. Under the light, his long eyelashes cast a small shadow on his lower eyelids. He had a high nose bridge, his lips naturally curved upward, and a clear and smooth jawline. His side profile made his facial features look even more three-dimensional and handsome. Just when I thought he had fallen asleep, he slowly opened his mouth again and said, "When you said we should be together during the meal, was it for revenge?" His voice was very low and a bit hoarse. Somehow, I felt that he was really melancholy at that moment. Facing Asher like this, I couldn't lie. "Yes." After I said this word, Asher suddenly laughed, but that laugh was too sad, and it made my heart ache unexpectedly when I heard it. He slowly opened his eyes, and there were emotions in his eyes that I couldn't understand flowing. He said, "It really cuts to the heart, Ruby. You're really cruel." I bit my lower lip, lowered my head and looked at my toes. I didn't argue, and there was nothing to argue about. Asher must be very disappointed in me. Knowing that Celeste liked him, I wanted to use him to take revenge. I think maybe I'm not just cruel but vicious. But being betrayed really hurts. Delete the recording. Asher's voice sounded like a surrender after a struggle. "I promise you." Was it for Celeste? I thought he should also like Celeste. After all, she chased him for 5 years. Even a stone should have been warmed up by now. I tilted my head slightly and peeked at him from the corner of my eye. Having known each other for years, this was the first time I saw a look that could be called sad on Asher's usually cold face. My heart felt like it was scratched by a cat's sharp claws, aching bit by bit and oozing sticky blood bubbles. "What are you promising me?" I pretended not to understand and asked. Asher didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me intently with his peach blossom eyes. He had really beautiful eyes. When he looked at someone seriously, it seemed that his eyes were filled with deep affection. Didn't Celeste fall for him because of a single glance back then? These peach blossom eyes were really good at deceiving people. After a few minutes, he tightened his jaw and slowly said those three words, "Be together." I pressed my lips together and smiled, but my hands clenched the edge of the chair tightly. I heard myself say, "Okay, let's be together." Since Celeste could stab me in the back, it wasn't too much for me to retaliate in the same way, right? I asked him again, "What if you want to break up after I delete the recording?" "No break up," he answered firmly, and then added, "And don't you think about breaking up either." He probably said such things because he was really provoked. Just like I was crazy to take revenge on that pair of cheaters, he should have the same idea as me. I actually felt a sense of empathy as fellow victims of betrayal. I took out my phone, pretended to delete a few photos, then opened WeChat, found Celeste and started typing rapidly. "I'm with Asher now. Do you know why? His condition was that I delete the recording." "Ha ha ha, Celeste, he could agree to such a request for your reputation. Are you happy? After making yourself dirty, you find out that the man you've been chasing for 5 years might have feelings for you. Does it feel good?" I didn't know if she felt good or not, but I sure felt good. Celeste immediately sent a voice message. I hung up and sent her another message. Actually, I didn't have a recording at all. "Why are you so gullible?" After sending it successfully, I immediately blocked her. I'm not the kind of saint who can smile and forgive when others stab me. The most painful thing isn't that you can't see hope after trying hard, but that you find out success was just around the corner after you've given up. It's like digging for gold buried in the ground. You dig for a long, long time but don't find it. Although you're sad, you'll soon get over it because you'll think that maybe you made the wrong choice. But if someone takes the shovel from your hand and with just one light shovel, they dig out the gold mine, for the rest of your life, this thing will be like a thorn in your heart. Before long, Asher's phone rang. There was no need to guess. It must be Celeste. I sat quietly beside him, continuing to stare at my toes in a daze. Because I was close, I could clearly hear the hysterical crying on the other end. Celeste was constantly begging and apologizing. She said, "Asher, please forgive me. I drank too much last night. It was Damon. Damon forced me." She also said, "Ruby didn't have a recording. She lied to you. Don't be with her. Please, please." I couldn't help grinning when I heard her crying. While smiling, tears dropped one by one onto the smooth floor. How blind I must have been to be sisters with such a person for more than 20 years. Soon Asher interrupted her, "Sorry, don't call me again in the future. She won't be happy." After saying that, he immediately hung up the phone, blocked her number casually, and then put the phone in his pocket. The community hospital at night was very quiet. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the wall and my sobbing. After a long time, Asher spoke again, his voice carrying an indescribable sense of repress. "Don't cry." I raised my head to look at him and joked, "Why, do you feel sorry for me?" He pursed his lips and replied after a few seconds, "You look ugly when you cry." Yeah, how could Asher feel sorry for me? The person he liked wasn't me, however, he was really straightforward. So what if I looked ugly? He didn't have to say it out loud. The momentary sense of empathy as fellow victims of betrayal that had just emerged disappeared in an instant, until the intravenous drip was finished. I didn't say another word to Asher. And Asher was the kind of taciturn person. If I didn't speak, he naturally wouldn't take the initiative to strike up a conversation with me either. It was already past 11 o'clock when we came out of the hospital. I kicked the small stones on the ground, considering whether to go to a hotel and book a room. To be honest, the thought of going back and having to continue facing Celeste now made me feel sick. She probably didn't want to see me either at this moment. After all, I snatched Asher, the person she cared about the most, from her after she betrayed me. After knowing and accompanying each other for more than 20 years, we finally ended up hating and resenting each other. Behind me, Asher hooked the hood of my hoodie again and pulled it gently. "Are you going back?" he asked me. His voice was warm and gentle, very pleasant to the ear. I shook my head and answered honestly, "I don't want to." "Then come to my place?" Under the warm-colored street lamp, the atmosphere was rendered a bit ambiguous. A light pink flush appeared on Asher's handsome, expressionless face. Like blooming weeping crabapple flowers, it swayed with all kinds of charm. Even though I'm not someone who's easily attracted by looks, for a moment, my heart skipped a beat when I saw this beauty blushing shyly. I rejected the offer without thinking. Although we were nominally in a romantic relationship at present, we both knew the real reason behind it clearly. There was no love between us. We were just pawns used by each other to take revenge on the betrayers. It was really inappropriate for me to go to his place. Asher didn't force me either. He just frowned slightly and asked me, "Then where are you going to stay tonight?" "A hotel, I guess." However, when we got to the hotel, I couldn't book a room because I didn't bring my ID card. So I had to follow Asher to his place. Our shadows in the night were stretched long. After walking side by side for a while, Asher broke the silence and said, "The recording you mentioned, was it fake?" "Yes." When I saw Damon and Celeste entangled naked together, my mind went blank. How could I have thought of recording or taking some pictures to keep as evidence at that time? I stopped in my tracks, looked up at him and asked, "So, are you planning to break up?" Asher's extremely handsome face showed no signs of happiness or anger. Only his voice sounded a bit irritable when he spoke. "I've said that I won't break up, and don't you even think about it. Don't mention the word breakup again in the future." My figure was clearly reflected in his light brown pupils, giving the illusion that he was completely focused on me. If I hadn't realized that the person he liked was Celeste, I might really have mistaken that he had feelings for me. Suddenly, I felt extremely tired. I shifted my gaze to the tall office building not far away and murmured, "I want to go home. Go back to the small county town where I grew up." Compared to taking revenge, what I needed more now was to heal my wounds. I couldn't make myself become hateful just for two unworthy people. Asher accompanied me back to the rental house to get my ID card. I simply packed up all my belongings and handed them to him for safekeeping. Since things had already come to this point, it was impossible for us to live under the same roof anymore. So let me be the one to leave. Celeste didn't know where she had gone. She hadn't come back by the time I finished packing up everything. Well, considering our current relationship, there was no need for a proper goodbye. Carrying my luggage, I walked to the door, took one last look around the place where I had lived for 2 years, and still felt a dull pain in my chest. Taking a deep breath, I forced a smile and said softly to Asher, "Let's go." Asher sent me to the station. I didn't let him accompany me into the waiting room. Even though we weren't that familiar with each other, parting was always sad. For the words about being together, it was just a farce when we were blinded by anger. It couldn't be taken seriously. When the farce ended, there was no need to deliberately say the word breakup again. Before going through the security check, I said goodbye to Asher. Suddenly, he reached out and pulled me into his arms, murmuring in my ear, "Come back early." After saying that, he immediately let go of me before I could react. I smiled at him, neither agreeing nor refusing. I didn't know how to tell him that I probably wouldn't come back to this city again. I stayed here in the first place because of Damon and Celeste, but now, there was no need for that anymore. It was already the evening of the next day when I got home. My mother was cooking in the kitchen. When she heard the door open, she poked her head out of the kitchen. She was very surprised to see me carrying a suitcase. "Ruby, why did you come back suddenly?" My nose felt sour. I dropped the suitcase, rushed over to her, hugged her and started crying and complaining. "Damon slept with Celeste, Mom. I'm so sad." I was really, really sad. The spatula in my mother's hand fell and clattered onto the floor. After a long while, she finally came to her senses and gently patted my back to comfort me. "Okay, stop crying. Fortunately, you found out before getting married. It's also a blessing in disguise. If this hadn't happened, Damon and I had planned to get married at the end of this year. Celeste had even accompanied me to try on wedding dresses a few days ago. How ironic. After staying at home for a few days, there were rumors in the village. They said that I had snatched Celeste's boyfriend and couldn't bear to stay in City A anymore, so I came back in disgrace. There was no need to guess. These words must have come from Celeste's mother. My mother was so angry that she went straight to their house and had a big quarrel with Celeste's mother. I didn't refute a word. I just pulled her back home. My mother pointed at my forehead and scolded me for being spineless, for not knowing how to fight back even after being bullied like this. In the end, she started crying. I wiped her tears while coaxing her, "It's just not the right time yet." What's the rush? Yes, I was waiting for an opportunity to prove my innocence and leave Celeste's mother with no room to retort. Soon, that opportunity came. On the evening 2 days later, Damon appeared at my doorstep. It was raining heavily that day. He just stood in the rain curtain, holding onto the iron fence on the wall of my yard and shouting my name again and again. His shouts made the nearby dogs bark one after another. After shouting for about 20 minutes, I opened the yard gate with an umbrella. It wasn't that I felt sorry for him getting wet in the rain. Mainly, I wanted the dogs to be quiet. After all, since they had been barking for so long, quite a few nosy people had come out to watch the fun. If I didn't deal with it, others might lose interest and leave. Damon wiped the rain off his face. In the heavy rain, his eyes were narrowed into slits. I stood in front of him, looking at his embarrassed appearance, and the image of him and Celeste entangled together automatically flashed through my mind. How much I liked him before, now I felt that much disgust. Go away. Don't come to look for me again, I said calmly, putting the umbrella on my shoulder. I had blocked all his contact information. In the past 2 days, he had harassed me by changing many different numbers, asking me how he could be forgiven. But how could I forgive him? Damon bent his body down, knelt on one knee, and then the other standing leg quickly followed and knelt down too. He just knelt straight in front of me, lowered his head and begged me hoarsely to give him one more chance. The rain splashed into one spray after another on his bowed back. This kneeling completely dispelled the little obsession and unwillingness that I still had left. A man's knees are as precious as gold. One should only kneel to the sky, the earth, and one's parents. In my opinion, casually kneeling just to seek peace was really spineless. I still stood straight and said in a flat voice without any emotion, "Damon, don't make me look down on you." After saying that, I turned around and went home without looking back. My relationship with Damon, I once thought it was a fated encounter. The first time I met him was at a club debate competition. He stood at the door, smiled and greeted me, "Your name is Ruby." What a coincidence. I'm Damon. Behind him was the bright winter sun. The next day, I met him outside the school again. To be precise, I fished him out of the river. He jumped into the river to save a drowning child, but then his leg cramped and he couldn't get out by himself. I happened to pass by and didn't hesitate to jump in. I sent the child, who was almost unable to struggle anymore, to the shore, and then swam back to pull him out, who was still thrashing around. It was very cold in the 12th lunar month. He slumped on the shore, wrung the water from the hem of his shirt, and joked with me, "You saved me. I should repay you. How about I marry you?" After that day, Damon started to pursue me in a high-profile way. He said, "Your name is Ruby, and my name is Damon. Look, even our names match so well." Yes, our names matched so well. But that didn't stop him from cheating. Damon knelt outside my yard for a long time. Even my parents took turns trying to persuade him to leave, but they couldn't. This was also within my expectation. I still knew Damon's temper. Then, I didn't hesitate to call the police. The shrill sound of the police siren stopped in front of my house all the way, attracting more onlookers. Damon explained to the police that he was my boyfriend. I stood in the yard, raised my voice across the railing and shouted at him, "Boyfriend? Why didn't you think you were my boyfriend when you slept with Celeste?" I know too well how gossipy the old women in the village who love to watch the fun are. I walked through the crowd that had gathered together and fixedly looked at Celeste's mother. She was whispering to the person beside her. Hearing my words, she rushed out of the crowd, pointed at me and cursed, "Don't you fucking slander our Celeste for no reason. It was clearly you who snatched Celeste's boyfriend. Fortunately, Celeste still regarded you as her own sister. Aren't you afraid of being struck by lightning for saying such things?" Finally, she spat on the ground. "Bah, you shameless slut." I didn't say a word. I just pulled a straight face, took out my phone from my pocket, and clicked on a recording. "What, are you scared now? Why didn't you think there would be today when you were fooling around with Damon in bed?" "No, I not, Ruby, how could you wrong me? Do you want me to play the recording?" After a few minutes of silence, Asher's voice came out again. "I'm going back." Then came Celeste's plea. "Asher, I'm wrong. Please forgive me. We're just friends. Who you're with is your freedom. There's no such thing as forgiveness or not." The recording stopped abruptly. Whether there was slander or not was clear at a glance. I didn't have the recording from that moment, but that didn't mean I didn't know to leave something behind after I calmed down later. The recording was secretly made in case Celeste tried to turn the tables. Afraid of causing more trouble, I decisively deleted it after playing it. Damon was finally persuaded to leave by the police. As the crowd dispersed, Celeste's mother didn't have the face to stay any longer either. She went home, blushing with shame and anger. She had damaged my reputation first. Was it too much for me to pay her back in her own coin? I stood in the yard with an umbrella for a long time. In the end, my mother was worried that I would catch a cold and called me into the house. Asher added me on WeChat on the night when I left City A. In the past few days, he would occasionally send me a few messages to share his daily life. The flower on the high mountain stepped down from the altar and became a bit more lively and earthly. I opened his chat window and took the initiative to contact him for the first time. "Could you help me send all my luggage back home? It's okay to pay the freight upon delivery. Thank you." After a long while, Asher replied, "Okay. Address?" After I sent the address, instead of the luggage arriving, the person who was supposed to send the luggage came. Spring is a very healing season. Even the wind blowing towards me is sweet. When I was standing on the thick branches of the big locust tree by the river to pick the locust flowers, I saw Asher walking slowly towards me through the mottled gaps in the tree. He was wearing an iron gray windbreaker, and the hem of the coat was swaying in the wind, creating small ripples in my heart. I pushed aside the branches in front of me and called out to him at the top of my voice, "Hey Asher." Asher looked around but didn't find me. So I simply grabbed the branch and sat on it, swinging my legs and watching him leisurely. The warm sun in the evening cast a faint layer of golden powder on him. He stood straight on the bluestone road, with ancient self-built rural buildings on both sides. It was like a beautiful oil painting of the Jiangnan region. Because of my movements, some locust flowers fell from the tree. Asher's searching eyes looked over. I asked him with a smile, "Why are you here?" Asher was flustered for a moment. It was only after a few minutes that he replied sullenly, "To find you." The leaves overlapped and the fragrance of the flowers filled the air. I sat on the tree while he stood under it. We looked at each other from a distance across the green leaves and white flowers. His beautiful peach blossom eyes narrowed slightly, and that illusion that he had feelings for me swept over me again. I shifted my gaze, my cheeks burning. I cursed in my heart, what a troublemaker. It's okay that he's good looking, but even his words are so thought-provoking. When my mother came looking for me with a bamboo winnowing basket, I was picking strings of locust flowers and throwing them down. Asher was catching them with his windbreaker below. There was a bit of nervousness on his extremely handsome face that seemed to be a masterpiece of the goddess Nuwa. "Ruby," my mother called me. My hand holding the branch shook, and my body swayed involuntarily. "Be careful," Asher shouted. His usually calm voice trembled a little. The locust flowers in his arms were scattered all over the ground. I steadied myself and looked at the strings of white flowers stained with mud on the ground, feeling a bit sorry. I had planned to take these home and ask my mother to make locust flower cakes. My mother squatted down, picked up the strings of locust flowers on the ground one by one, and put them into the basket. Then she said to Asher with a smile, "Don't worry, young man. This naughty girl has been climbing trees and walls since she was a child. She won't fall. I felt a bit embarrassed by what she said and called out coquettishly, Mom. Asher also blushed slightly and politely called out, Auntie. After learning that Asher was my friend, my mother enthusiastically invited him to our home for dinner. After dinner, I walked him to the nearby hotel. Just as we walked out of the yard gate, we happened to meet Felix, who was coming to look for me. Felix was my and Celeste's childhood friend. Because I had a carefree personality, I was closer to him. He glanced at Asher beside me, frowned and pulled me aside, whispering, Comrade Ruby, you should pay attention to your behavior. You can't follow in Celeste's footsteps. After these past few days of fermentation and spread, Celeste's reputation had been completely ruined. I had already expected the current result when I played the recording. In the countryside, along with the spring breeze, besides the fragrance of flowers, there were also gossips. I didn't feel as comfortable as I had imagined. Instead, I felt a bit gloomy. I asked him in a muffled voice, Where are you going? Hearing this, Felix showed his big white teeth, which were shiny in the bright moonlight. I was just coming to find you, he said with a smile. I'll take you to see fireflies. Fireflies are memories that remain in our childhood. When we were young, there were a lot of fireflies in the town. They twinkled, lighting up the night skies in spring and summer. Celeste and I liked to catch them with nets. After gathering a certain number, we would let them fly. When the dots of fluorescence were flying all over the sky, we would close our eyes and make wishes. Now, when I think about the past, it's unavoidably bitter. Any frame of memory is full of Celeste's shadow. It can be said that she really participated in the first half of my life. In recent years, fireflies have been rarely seen. I turned my head to look at Asher and asked him, Do you want to go and see fireflies? Asher's gaze stopped on my arm that Felix was holding. His handsome eyebrows furrowed almost imperceptibly. Only when I called him again did he slowly nod. Unlike the prosperity of the city, the rural nights were so quiet that you could hear the chirping of insects. We walked into the night, taking one step deep and one step shallow as we headed towards the back mountain. In the small towns in the Jiangnan region, there were many rolling mountains and winding waters. The road was uneven. I stumbled over a stone and staggered. Felix wanted to help me, but Asher got there first. He reached out, grabbed my wrist, pulled me back gently, and then put his other hand on my shoulder to steady my body that was about to fall forward. After I stood firmly, the hand holding my wrist moved down and firmly wrapped my hand in his big hand. I struggled a few times but couldn't break free. Looking at him in the hazy moonlight, I could only see his clear and graceful jawline and high nose bridge. His particularly beautiful eyes were hidden in the darkness, and his expression was unclear. Watch your step, he said softly. Perhaps it was because of the environment that his words seemed a bit charming. My cheeks were burning. I shook my wrist to signal him to let go. The hand holding mine tightened a bit, the light was too dim. I wasn't sure if I had mistaken the smile on Asher's lips just now, but what he said was so clear that there was no way I could have misheard it. He said, If I remember correctly, your current identity is my girlfriend. I followed behind him and explained in a low voice, I was angry at that time. Asher interrupted me, Ruby, I've said it before. There will be no breakup. I was led by Asher all the way up the mountain. The mountain wasn't high, and we soon reached the top. The fireflies in the forest were flying around, twinkling like stars falling into the mortal world, dreamy and beautiful. I looked up at Asher. Coincidentally, he was also looking down at me, his eyes focused. I quickly shifted my gaze in a flustered manner and asked him dryly, Do you want to make a wish? Asher also looked away and watched the flickering fluorescence. No need. My wish has already come true. His voice wasn't loud, but it was especially clear in this empty mountain forest. My heart skipped a beat. I tilted my head slightly to peek at the tall and straight man beside me. A firefly landed on his thick black hair, shining brightly. He looked straight ahead, with tenderness that couldn't be melted in his eyes. I finally understood why Celeste had fallen in love with him at first sight. Such a stunning beauty. How could one not be attracted to him? On the 5th day that Asher stayed in our town, Celeste came back. She had lost a lot of weight and looked even weaker. She blocked our doorstep, pulled my sleeve, and started crying, "Ruby, could you give Asher back to me? Please." She had always been like this since she was a child. She was good at putting on a pitiful look to make me help her. In the past, I was really taken in by her. I frowned and pulled my clothes out of her hand and said in a deep voice, "I don't have the right to make decisions for him. Ask him yourself." After saying that, I called Asher and asked him to come over. As soon as I hung up the phone, Celeste, who was still crying, suddenly raised her arm and slapped herself hard. Her fair cheek instantly swelled up. I was surprised and asked her, "What are you doing?" She didn't answer but just bit her lip and continued to cry. At first glance, it seemed that I had bullied her. This was the scene that Asher saw when he arrived. He looked at me and then at Celeste and said with a bit of anger, "What's going on?" Celeste covered her already swollen cheek, and her tears fell even more fiercely. "Asher, don't blame Ruby. She didn't mean to hit me. So that's what she was up to." Anger rushed straight to my head. This was the person I had protected for more than 20 years. How blind I was. "Huh, I hit you?" I sneered, swung my arm, and slapped her on the other cheek. "Then I'll just make it real." Celeste might have been stunned by my slap and immediately stopped crying. She looked at me in disbelief with her big eyes. It was Asher who grabbed my hand immediately after I hit her. He held my hand, spread my palm open, blew on it gently twice, frowned, and asked me, "Does it hurt?" I was puzzled. "I hit the person you like. Aren't you angry?" Asher furrowed his brows even more tightly and asked in confusion, "When did I like her?" The spring breeze blew on our faces, making us feel warm. Asher lowered his head and seriously blew on my palm, his long eyelashes drooped down, looking so gentle that it made my heart flutter. Celeste came to her senses from being stunned and shouted in a shrill voice, "Asher!" Hearing her voice, Asher's just relaxed brows furrowed again. He looked back at Celeste and said impatiently, "Please don't harass my girlfriend again in the future." Celeste's slightly open lips trembled, and big tears fell down one after another. "Asher, I'm wrong. Could you forgive me? Don't treat me like this." She tremblingly tried to pull Asher, but Asher dodged. Asher's voice was polite but distant, "Please respect yourself." Just after saying this, the next second, Celeste fell down limply. Whether she really fainted or was just pretending, since she fainted at our doorstep, I couldn't just ignore her. I asked Asher to call 120, and I ran to her house to inform her parents. Celeste's mother had always been a bit of a shrew. Seeing that her daughter had fainted and there were obvious swellings on both sides of her cheeks, she naturally made a scene by pulling us and rolling around on the ground. When the ambulance arrived, she forced us to get on the ambulance together. Asher took my hand and wrapped it in his big hand. His voice seemed to have a magic that could soothe people's hearts. "It's okay. Don't worry." It wasn't really worry. I just felt a bit choked up and couldn't tell what kind of feeling it was. Celeste's examination results came out soon. She was in the early stage of pregnancy and suffered from malnutrition. There was no need to guess whose child it was. It was Damon's. Celeste's mother began to wail loudly. She only quieted down reluctantly after being warned by the nurse twice. Her father was an honest man. He sat on the stool with his head down, smoking cigarette after cigarette. It wasn't until he had smoked 2 cigarettes that he raised his head and looked at me. "Ruby, give that bastard a call and ask him to come here." I took Damon out of the blacklist. I didn't tell him what was going on. I just asked him to come over. He probably thought that I was the one looking for him, so he agreed readily. After Celeste woke up and learned that she was pregnant, she cried and made a fuss, saying that she wanted to have an abortion. The female doctor in a white coat stood beside her bed. Only when she had made enough of a fuss did the doctor slowly say, "Your constitution is very weak and the uterine wall is thinner than that of ordinary people. Having an abortion may lead to infertility in the future. You should think it over clearly." Celeste tightly grasped the bed sheet with both hands. Her eyes were red, Filled with inextinguishable regret and despair, Damon bought the earliest flight ticket and flew here. I called him in the morning and he arrived in the afternoon. I asked him to come directly to the hospital. The voice on the other end of the phone sounded full of worry. Ruby, what's wrong with you? Why are you in the hospital? Asher, who had been staying by my side all the time, heard his voice from the receiver. His handsome face darkened. He gently pulled my hair to signal me to hang up. I replied that he would know when he came and then hung up the phone directly. 10 minutes or so later, Damon called again. I told him the ward number and put his number back on the blacklist again in front of Asher. Only then did Asher's gloomy and handsome face clear up a little. Damon had deliberately tidied himself up before coming. He looked much more energetic than when he came to beg for peace last time. As soon as he showed up, Asher immediately took on the posture of an owner and held my hand. Damon was so provoked that his eyes became red. He rushed up, wanting to hit Asher. I pushed Asher away and immediately opened the door of the ward behind me with my other hand. Celeste is inside. Go in. Celeste's mother was sitting in front of the hospital bed. When she saw Damon, she jumped up from the stool and came over to grab Damon's clothes and dragged him inside. She muttered, "My daughter is pregnant with your child. What are you going to do about it?" Damon froze. The flush on his face faded away. He looked back at me, panicked and at a loss. I didn't want to get involved in their mess anymore, so I took Asher and left. When we walked to the end of the corridor, we could still hear Celeste's mother scolding, "Are you even human? That's your child." I looked up at Asher and smiled, saying softly, "Let's go." Outside the hospital, the sun was shining brightly and the spring scenery was just right. There was still a long way for me to go in the future, but Damon and Celeste would no longer be on my way. Asher only had a week's vacation. Before going back to City A, he asked me if I wanted to go with him. I refused, since he said that he didn't like Celeste. His attitude towards me had become increasingly ambiguous. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking and I didn't dare to ask for confirmation. After all, I still remembered that he had said I was ugly. After Asher left, every day I would climb up that big locust tree, sit on the thick branches, swing my legs and look at the road along which he had come, wondering if he would suddenly appear again. On weekends when Felix was off work, he would come to find me and sit beside me. He would pick a string of leaves, strip them off until only the stalk was left, and put it in his mouth, looking a bit rascal. He said, "Celeste is getting married. To your ex-boyfriend." I said, "I know. One didn't want to marry and the other didn't want to marry either. But this might be Celeste's only chance to become a mother." In the end, Damon couldn't resist Celeste's mother's threats of killing herself. The long leaf stalks were moving up and down in Felix's mouth. He imitated me, swinging his legs and looking at the road ahead in a daze. The wind blew and the leaves rustled. The white flowers on the whole tree swayed. I closed my eyes, tilted my head slightly upward and felt the gentle spring breeze. I felt neither sad nor happy. This time, I had completely let go, whether it was of Damon or Celeste. When I was going home, I happened to meet Celeste, who was going out to throw away the garbage. She looked even more haggard than the previous 2 days. There was hardly any flesh left on her face. Her cheekbones protruded high, making her look rather mean. She stopped me when I was about to leave. Her big eyes with thick dark circles were full of resentment. "Ruby, don't be too smug. Asher will never like you." I shrugged my shoulders and said in a calm tone, "So what? You chased him for 5 years, but he didn't fall for you either, did he? Oh, by the way, Damon came to me last night, begging me to get back together. It's so annoying. I'm not a garbage recycling station here." "Ah!" Celeste screamed and threw the garbage bag in her hand at me. "You bitch." I took 2 steps to the side to dodge it and continued to irritate her. "Watch your garbage. I've already said that I'm not a garbage recycling station." In the end, we still tore our faces apart and couldn't even keep the last bit of dignity. Celeste's home wasn't far from mine. Or rather, it was very close, so close that you could hear the quarrels coming from her house when you were standing in the yard. I was watering the flowers when Damon slammed the door and walked out. When I looked up, I saw the scratches on his face with blood beads still oozing out. Damon's eyes brightened for a moment, but soon dimmed. He stood straight on the spot and stammered, "Ruby." He looked lonely and wretched. I put down the watering can in my hand and nodded at him. "Well, you're getting married. I wish you a harmonious marriage in advance. I won't deny that I did it on purpose." Damon forced a wry smile, and there was a glimmer of moisture in his eyes. He murmured, "Is it possible?" "Whether it's possible or not, isn't it all his own doing?" I ignored him and went into the house without looking back, perhaps for fear of unexpected changes. Damon and Celeste's wedding was held in a hurry. Celeste's mother was really calculating. Anyway, Damon was an elite in the workplace, and his income was much higher than that of our peers in the town. Naturally, she couldn't wait for her daughter to marry him as soon as possible. Due to the child in her belly, Celeste's family didn't ask for betrothal gifts and didn't prepare a dowry either. The two of them went to get their marriage certificate and set up a few banquet tables, and that was it. My mother shook her head and sighed, "Another unhappy couple." Hearing this, I smiled and said, "We just need to live our own lives well. Whether others are unhappy or not has nothing to do with us." My mother nodded, "That's true. They are married anyway. But what about you? When are you going to get married?" "I think that Asher is quite nice. He's handsome and polite." I was speechless. The day after my mother finished nagging, the handsome and polite Asher had a car accident. The call was from his roommate, the same one who had urged me to confess my feelings back then. After hanging up the phone, I hurriedly opened the ticket-buying app and chose the nearest flight. My heart was beating fast, and a bitter taste spread in my mouth. I must have fallen in love with him. As for all the ambiguities he showed towards me before, whether it was because of a crush or something else, it didn't matter anymore. Asher was lying alone on the hospital bed. His right leg was in a cast, and his right arm was also in a splint, fixed with a bandage and hung around his neck. Fortunately, his face wasn't injured. Hearing the sound, he opened his eyes and looked over. When he saw me, his beautiful eyebrows and eyes curved slightly. "Why are you here?" He tried to move his body a little, and his handsome face instantly wrinkled up. I quickly stepped forward to stop him. "Don't move around." He muttered in a low voice, "It hurts." It sounded like he was acting coquettishly. "Still no, it hurts." I scolded him, and my face slowly became hot. Asher pursed his lips and looked up at me. His long eyelashes blinked and blinked, making my heart itch. Then he replied very seriously, "Yes." He was actually quite cute. Because of the sentence, "I don't like strangers touching me," I took on the job of taking care of Asher. It was easy to wash his clothes and cook for him, and it wasn't difficult to feed him either. But when it came to going to the toilet, Asher pressed my hand on his waistband with his uninjured left hand and said with a red face, "I can do this by myself. If you want me to help, it's okay. But after all, it's my first time. You have to be responsible for me." I was stunned for a moment. When I realized what he said, a wave of heat rushed to my face. I gave him a blank look, bit my lower lip, and ran out of the bathroom in a panic. Was this still the Asher I knew? Asher had a minor fracture and needed to stay in the hospital for a week. During this week, I met all the people in his circles. When he introduced me to others, he always said just one sentence, "My girlfriend." When someone teased him about how he managed to win me over, he slightly raised one eyebrow with a bit of pride. "She chased me. It wasn't false." After all, regardless of the reason at the beginning, it was me who proposed that we be together. The day Asher was discharged from the hospital was a sunny day with a bright sun. He leaned against the wall beside the head of the bed and watched me busying around. The sunlight outside the window shone in, and he narrowed his eyes slightly as if enjoying it. The corners of his mouth turned up, looking so charming as if it had the magic to bewitch people. I couldn't help but stare blankly. Because I was so attracted by his good looks that I didn't notice the road under my feet. When I was about to reach the bed, I accidentally tripped and my body uncontrollably threw itself onto Asher. My lips touched something soft. My eyes widened. I pressed his chest, trying to use the force to stand up. However, The second after my lips separated from his, a hand pressed on the back of my head, stopping me from moving backward. Asher was close to my lips and murmured softly, "Ruby, you bumped into me yourself." The hand on my head pushed slightly, and I touched that soft thing again. It seemed that a long time had passed, and it also seemed that only a moment had passed. Big fireworks were blooming in my mind, magnificent and gorgeous, until a clear cough interrupted us. I pushed Asher away in a panic, blushed, and wanted to run outside, but he quickly grabbed me with sharp eyes and quick hands. The arm that grabbed me was still wrapped with a bandage, and 2 splints were wrapped in the middle of the bandage. The long bandage hanging around his neck, which was supposed to support his arm, was now empty and swayed left and right with his movements. I was dumbfounded and belatedly remembered that it seemed that the hand that pressed on my head just now was also his right hand. "Congratulations. Finally, you've achieved a happy ending," someone said behind us. It wasn't easy, Asher. "Does this count as seeing the light after the dark clouds?" Another person said. I slowly turned around. There were 3 boys standing at the door, and they were all familiar faces. I had bothered them a lot when I was inquiring about Asher's information back then. Asher's handsome face darkened with the displeasure of being interrupted. "You can leave now. Asher, you're not nice. I helped you trick sister-in-law here." The one who called me started to complain but halfway through realized that he had said something wrong. He quickly grinned at me and said, "Sister-in-law, we have something to do, so we'll leave first." After saying that, he pushed his companions, and the 3 of them said goodbye to me and ran away laughing. A happy ending? Seeing the light after the dark clouds? Trick? I was completely confused. "Was your car accident fake?" I asked, looking at his leg that was still in a cast. "Well, not exactly." Asher lowered his head like a child who had done something wrong. "I was scratched by a bicycle when I went out that morning." I was speechless. "I need an explanation." Asher held my finger bones and spoke slowly, "I just missed you. Ruby, it's been 5 years. Do you know how long the waiting without hope is?" Asher didn't tell me too much. He gave me a notebook, which recorded every bit of his life in these 5 years. 5 years of bitter unrequited love. It turned out that in the years I didn't know, he had already quietly loved me for so long. I finally stayed in City A, this time because of Asher. Time flew by. I drew a comic story based on the story of Asher and me, and it became quite popular. I also jumped from being an unknown little painter to a somewhat famous cartoonist. When I went back to visit my parents, I ran into Celeste a few times. She was walking towards me with a big belly and was no longer as lively and delicate as before. We were like 2 complete strangers, passing by each other. All the love and hatred in the past were submerged in the long river of time. A few months later, I was working on my drawing when my mother called me. "Ruby, Celeste is gone." "Gone? So what?" I said casually while drawing the lines. "Where did she go?" Through the phone, my mother's voice sounded particularly repressed. "She had postpartum depression and committed suicide." The movement of my hand stopped, and my mind went blank. "Ruby, Ruby, are you listening?" "Yes, Mom, I'm here," I replied to her, my voice choked. When I wiped my face, it was already wet.